Good morning, friends. There comes a moment in every believer's life when the trial is no longer just a lesson, but a final refining fire. It does not announce its arrival with the roar of a storm. Rather, it creeps in like a whisper, testing the soul in ways unseen by the world. Every believer faces a final test, not as punishment, but as a refining fire designed to shape the soul for eternity. From the beginning, faith has always been tested. It was never meant to be a passive belief, resting in comfort and ease. Rather, it is something proven in the unseen battles of the heart, forged in the tension between doubt and trust. Faith that is never tested remains weak, but the faith that endures trials emerges unshakable. In life, the trials we encounter serve a purpose beyond what we immediately understand. We are told in the Bible that God disciplines those he loves, not to break them, but to strengthen them. When Abraham was called to sacrifice his son, the test was not for God to learn Abraham's heart. God already knew. It was for Abraham to discover the depth of his own trust. It was a moment when the promise and the command seemed to be in conflict. Yet faith was required to believe that God's goodness would prevail. The final test does not come to destroy, but to reveal. Often, it arrives at the edge of a great blessing, just before a deeper calling, when everything seems settled. It strips away human reasoning and demands a response beyond mere words. It is in these moments that one's faith is not merely professed, but proven. In the Bible, we are said to count it joy when trials come. Not because suffering itself is good, but because perseverance must complete its work, so that we may be mature and lacking nothing. Some tests come in the form of great loss, where the heart is stretched beyond what it thought it could endure. Others come in the form of waiting, where silence from heaven feels like abandonment. There are moments when God seems distant, when prayers feel unanswered, and when every path forward appears to be blocked. But these are the very seasons where faith is tested most deeply, not in the noise of miracles, but in the quiet trust of obedience. Even Christ himself was led into the wilderness, where he was tested in ways that reached beyond physical hunger. The enemy offered shortcuts, easier paths to glory, yet each time Christ responded not with human reasoning, but with truth. His final test came in Gethsemane, where his surrender was not forced but freely given. If the perfect Son of God was tested, how much more will those who follow him face moments that demand unwavering trust? This is the nature of the final test. It is not a test of knowledge, nor one that can be passed by mere religious practice. It is the test of the heart, the kind that asks, do you trust him even now? It is not designed to remove faith, but to reveal its depth. And those who endure, those who hold firm to what they cannot see, find themselves refined, ready, and prepared for a glory that outweighs the suffering. The test is often unexpected, arriving not when one feels ready, but in the moments when faith is least prepared for the weight of trial. It does not announce itself with signs and warnings, nor does it give the luxury of preparation. Instead, it comes like a sudden storm, revealing the foundation upon which a life is built. Many walk through life believing they will recognize the moment of their greatest trial, yet when it comes, it is seldom in the form imagined. In Scripture, we are given countless examples of those who faced trials they never foresaw. Joseph, favored by his father and given dreams of greatness, never anticipated his greatest test would begin with betrayal by his own brothers. Sold into slavery and thrown into prison for a crime he did not commit, his test was not merely one of suffering, but of trust. Trust that God's plan was still unfolding even in the darkness. The Bible tells us that what others intended for harm, God intended for good. Yet in the moment of trial, it would have been impossible for Joseph to see the full picture. Trials often come in the silence of waiting. The people of Israel, delivered from slavery, expected immediate entry into the land of promise. Yet their test came in the wilderness, where thirst, hunger, and uncertainty exposed their hearts. They were not prepared for the waiting, and in their impatience many turned away. The test was not simply about reaching the destination, but about who they became in the journey. In the Bible we are said that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. It is in these unexpected trials that dependence on God is tested, proving whether faith is rooted in circumstances or in the unchanging nature of the one who calls. Sometimes the test comes not in hardship but in comfort. Solomon, granted wisdom beyond any before him, was tested not by suffering but by abundance. It was not pain that led his heart astray, but the slow, unnoticed drift of compromise. His wisdom remained, yet his devotion wavered, showing that a test does not always appear as difficulty. The enemy of faith is not always adversity. It is often complacency. The test can come in the form of success, in seasons where reliance on God is no longer seen as necessary. In the Bible, we are said to guard our hearts, for everything flows from it. A heart unguarded in times of ease is just as vulnerable as one pressed under the weight of suffering. The test comes when it is least expected, because faith must be proven in both the highs and the lows. The disciples, walking daily with Jesus, did not expect their moment of trial would come in the form of fear and abandonment on the night he was taken. Peter, bold in his proclamations, never imagined he would deny the one he swore to follow to the end. The test does not wait for strength. It reveals whether faith stands in weakness, and in these unexpected moments, the heart's true devotion is made known. It's not about passing or failing, but surrendering. The final test is not given to measure human ability, nor does it operate on the standards of earthly success. God does not place trials before his people to see how strong they are, nor does he watch from a distance, grading each response like an examiner. The test of faith is not about proving worthiness, but about yielding fully to the one who is already worthy. It is not about demonstrating perfection, but about releasing control. Abraham, when asked to sacrifice his son, was not given a test to prove his ability, but to reveal his willingness to trust. He was not expected to reason his way through it or to find a way around it. He was simply asked to obey. In the Bible, we are said that obedience is better than sacrifice, for it is not the grand gestures that God desires, but the heart that is fully surrendered. The test was never about whether Abraham could carry out the task. It was about whether he would trust God even when the command made no sense. His faith was not in his own ability to endure loss, but in God's power to provide. Surrender does not mean passivity, nor does it mean resignation to suffering. It is not the absence of struggle, but the choice to trust in the midst of it. When Job lost everything, his test was not whether he could find a way to restore what was taken, but whether he would still acknowledge God as sovereign. His friends searched for reasons, trying to rationalize his suffering, yet Job's surrender was not in understanding, but in worship. In the Bible, we are said that the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, but blessed is the name of the Lord. The test was not about endurance alone, but about surrendering the right to demand answers. Even Christ himself, on the night of his greatest trial, prayed for another way. In Gethsemane, his test was not about proving strength, but about yielding to the will of the Father. If the Son of God, in his humanity, could ask for the cup to be taken, yet still surrender with the words, "Not my will, but yours be done," then the greatest measure of faith is not in resisting hardship, but in embracing the will of God, even when it leads through suffering. Faith is not a performance to be perfected. It is a dependence to be deepened. The final test strips away self-reliance, and replaces it with trust. Many strive to pass their trials, thinking that success is found in avoiding failure, yet the only true failure is refusing to surrender. In the Bible we are said that His power is made perfect in weakness. The test is not about proving strength, but about releasing the need to rely on it. In surrender, there is victory, for in the yielding of the soul, God's greatest work is done. God's silence doesn't mean His absence. The final test often comes in moments when heaven seems quiet, when prayers seem to rise without answer, and when the voice of God is no longer heard as it once was. It is in these seasons that faith is tested most deeply, not through fire and thunder, but through the stillness where it seems as though God is nowhere to be found, yet His silence is not abandonment. It is in these moments of quiet that trust is refined, proving whether faith depends on feelings or on the unshakable truth of who God is. There are times when the silence of God is harder to bear than the trials themselves. When Jesus stood before Pilate, He did not defend Himself, though He had the power to silence His accusers. In the Bible we are said that like a lamb led to the slaughter, He did not open His mouth. The Son of God, who spoke creation into existence, chose silence in His greatest moment of trial. He understood what many struggle to accept, that silence is not the absence of power, but the working of a greater plan. Just as the silence of Jesus before His accusers was part of the path to redemption, so too does God's silence in trials serve a purpose beyond human understanding. In times of testing, it is natural to long for immediate answers, for a voice from heaven that reassures and directs. Yet some of the greatest figures of faith walked through seasons where God seemed distant. David, the man after God's own heart, cried out again and again, asking why God seemed so far away in his distress. In the Bible we are said that though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we are not alone, for He is with us. The silence of God does not mean His absence. It means trust is being deepened, faith is being purified, and reliance on Him is being strengthened beyond the need for constant reassurance. Even Christ experienced the weight of silence on the cross. In His final moments He cried out, asking why He had been forsaken. And yet, in that silence, the greatest act of redemption was unfolding. If the Son of God Himself was tested through silence, then those who follow Him will face the same refining. But silence does not mean separation, and the absence of a visible sign does not mean the absence of God's presence. Faith that only believes when it hears is not yet complete. The test of silence is the test of whether one will trust when the answers are not immediate, when the heavens seem still, and when God's presence is not felt, but only known by faith. In the Bible, we are said to be still and know that He is God. It is in the stillness, in the quiet, where no voice is heard, that the deepest faith is formed. Silence is not the end of the story. It is the space where faith learns to stand. The reward is greater than the struggle. Every test of faith, every season of trial, every moment of uncertainty is not without purpose. There is no suffering, no hardship, no silence from heaven that does not carry within it a promise far greater than the pain endured. The trials of life are not meaningless. They are the labor pains of something eternal being formed, something that outweighs every tear, every sacrifice, and every battle fought in faith. In the Bible, we are said that the present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed. This is the foundation of endurance, not the removal of pain, but the certainty that something greater is coming. Those who have walked the hardest roads, those who have endured the deepest trials, know that the presence of suffering does not mean the absence of purpose. The furnace that refines gold is the same that removes its impurities. And just as fire strengthens what it consumes, so too does the refining of faith produce something eternal. Joseph endured betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment, yet the years of suffering were not the end of his story. When the time was fulfilled, he was lifted to a position of honor, not for his own sake, but for the salvation of many. The trials were the necessary path to the fulfillment of God's greater plan. In the Bible, we are said that what the enemy meant for harm, God intends for good. The suffering of the righteous is never wasted. It is woven into a greater redemption. Even Job, who lost everything in a single moment, was not left in ruin. His faith was tested beyond what he thought he could endure, but the reward was restoration. What was taken was returned, and his latter days were greater than the former. Yet the true reward was not the material restoration, but the revelation of God himself. In the Bible, we are said that after Job's trial, he declared he had heard of God before, but now he had seen him. The suffering was not meaningless. It led to a greater knowledge of God, a deeper communion, and a faith that was no longer second-hand, but personal and unshakable. Even Christ, who endured the cross, did not suffer without reward. He despised the shame, but for the joy set before him, he endured. His suffering was not an end, but a doorway to resurrection, to victory over death, to the greatest triumph ever known. If the path of the Son of God led through suffering to glory, then those who follow him can be certain that their own trials are not in vain. In the Bible, we are said that those who endure will receive the crown of life. The suffering of this present time is real, but the glory that follows is far greater. It is this certainty that gives strength, this promise that allows faith to stand firm, knowing that what is to come will far surpass every trial endured. Jesus faced the ultimate test. His life was not one of ease or earthly glory, but of obedience, suffering, and complete surrender to the will of the Father. From the very beginning, his path was set towards sacrifice. Every miracle he performed, every word he spoke, every step he took was leading to the final test, one that would demand not only endurance, but absolute trust. He was not exempt from trials. He was not spared from sorrow. He walked the path of testing so that those who follow him would know they do not walk it alone. In the wilderness, he was tested in ways that reached beyond the physical. Hunger pressed upon him, but the true test was whether he would rely on the word of God alone. Power was offered to him, but the test was whether he would take a shortcut rather than follow the Father's plan. The kingdoms of the world were laid before him, but the trial was whether he would choose earthly rule over divine obedience. Each time, he stood firm, not by strength alone, but by truth. In the Bible, we are said that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. The test was not about proving himself, but about remaining faithful to the will of the Father, even when the way was hard. Yet the greatest test came not in the wilderness, but in the garden. In Gethsemane, the weight of all that was to come pressed upon him. The suffering was not only physical, but spiritual, as he carried the burden of sin, the weight of separation, and the full measure of human frailty. He prayed for another way, yet his surrender was perfect. In the Bible, we are said that he was sorrowful unto death, yet he still prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." The test was not whether he could endure the suffering, but whether he would trust the Father completely, even when the cost was everything. On the cross, the test reached its climax. The silence of heaven, the mockery of those who watched, the agony of bearing sin. This was the ultimate trial. Yet in his final breath, there was no defeat. In the Bible, we are said that he declared, "It is finished." The test was not about survival, but about obedience to the end, and because he endured, the grave was not the final word. His victory became the victory of all who would believe in him. The tests faced by those who follow Christ are not meaningless, for they are patterned after his own. The suffering endured is not a sign of abandonment, but of participation in something greater. In the Bible we are said that if we share in his suffering, we will also share in his glory. Jesus faced the final test so that all who trust in him might walk through their own trials with the confidence that the same Spirit who raised him from the dead now lives in them. The final test is not meant to destroy but to refine, not to break but to strengthen. Every trial, every silence, every moment of surrender is part of a greater purpose. It is in these tests that faith is proven, that trust is deepened, and that hearts are drawn closer to God. Jesus himself walked the path of testing, showing that suffering is not the end, but a doorway to glory. In the Bible we are said that those who endure will receive the crown of life. The struggles of this life are temporary, but the reward is eternal. God is not absent in the trials, he is present, working all things for good. The test is not about passing or failing, it is about trusting, surrendering, and holding firm to the truth that his plans are greater. And for those who remain steadfast, the final victory is assured.